I had put together this slideshow about IGG and why it's considered a tip. And I was going to put it out as we got closer to trial, but that's a moot point now. But I still feel it's important for people to understand why IGG is considered an investigative tool. It's considered a tip, and it's not completely submissible at trial, because I'm still still hearing a lot of people having confusion about that. So I decided to just go ahead and put this out. And it is a slideshow. I put together slides explaining about IGG. And I think it's also important, even though the Kohberger trial is not going to happen now, because IGG is being used more and more in contemporary cases now, not just cold cases, as a way to help find the perpetrator. So let's get started. What is investigative genetic genealogy, otherwise known as IGG? Well, IGG uses public DNA databases to identify genetic relatives of unknown DNA samples. It helps law enforcement build family trees and narrow suspect lists, and it is not direct evidence. It is only an investigative tool. But when the DNA does not get a match in CODIS, and it's not matching to anyone they've taken samples from, then IGG is a way that you can try to narrow down a suspect list. And it is considered an investigative tool. It is not direct evidence. Obviously, direct evidence is like the STR profile matches, where when they ran the STR profile on Kohberger and it matched the DNA on the sheath, that is direct evidence. But the IGG does not give you that direct match, and that's why you have to do the STR profile in addition. And this talks some more about that. IGG is an investigative tool, not evidence. It helps generate leads, but doesn't prove guilt. It's used to guide investigators to suspects, and it's followed by traditional evidence collection, surveillance, direct DNA sampling, etc. So it's like somebody calling the tip line and saying, hey, I think you should check out so-and-so because I think he drives the same type of car you're looking for, or I think I saw him in the neighborhood that night. So it's not direct evidence, but you can investigate to gather the direct evidence that could prove that the person is the perpetrator. So forensic standards and chain of custody. With IGG, they often use recreational DNA kits, not forensic grade tests. That's because when people input, and upload their sample onto databases like MyHeritage, they're using one of those kits that they send them. It's analyzed by genealogists, not certified forensic experts. Results lack the rigorous chain of custody needed for court admissibility, and it's treated similarly to an anonymous tip due to the lack of direct law enforcement control. Now, that's in contrast to like the ISP lab, who did the STR sample, the short tandem repeat sample, as opposed to the SNP, which is what's used for IGG. And the lab has rigorous standards, chain of custody, the forensic grade kits, etc. And that's why when you get a suspect narrowed down through investigative genetic genealogy, you have to do that STR profile match. You can't arrest someone without getting that match. And in the Kohberger case, they got a hit with his dad's DNA. So when they pulled the trash in Pennsylvania and it came back saying that the DNA on the sheath is the male offspring of the DNA from the trash. So Michael Kohberger's trash, the perp was the male offspring of Michael Kohberger, which was Brian Kohberger. That STR confirmed that. And then when Brian was arrested, then it was a direct match. But the IGG itself is not the same rigorous testing. Legal strategy and court use. IGG results are typically not introduced in court. They are used to identify suspects for follow-up with admissible evidence, and only validated DNA matches and corroborating evidence are presented in trial. So like I just talked about, the STR match is what is admissible. And that's what they arrested Kohberger based on, and that's what was going to be used at trial, was the STR samples and the STR match. And when Brett Payne said that the FBI never told him the DNA on the sheath was Kohberger's, that's because IGG cannot tell you definitively that that's the person's DNA. It can only narrow down through the family tree, through the genetics, who the suspect may be. So they can't say definitively, yes, that's his DNA in the sheath. What they can say is, hey, here's a tip. We believe the suspect is Brian Kohberger. Now you go out and investigate the rest of the way. So in summary, IGG is a valuable tool for generating investigative leads. It's not direct or admissible evidence, and it must be supported by traditional forensic methods for legal proceedings. So this is why Judge Hippler asked the prosecution and the defense to come up with a way to mention the tip, because it is handled like a tip. The IGG itself is not admissible, but it's a tip. Just like I said, if somebody called on the phone and said, hey, I saw this guy driving a white Elantra, you follow up on that tip, and then you can get hopefully admissible evidence based on that tip, which is exactly what they did with Kohberger. FBI found with the family tree, it led them to Brian Kohberger, and then the DNA through the STR match said yes, it's Brian Kohberger's DNA on that snap. And the STR is what's admissible in court. The IGG is not. So you have to try to introduce it as a tip, or you don't have to introduce it at all. But Bicca Barlow is who spoke up and said, well, it helps with jury confusion to at least mention a tip. So that's why Hippler asked them to come up with who was going to introduce it, Brett Payne, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not asking anyone to lie. It's not asking anyone to fabricate anything. I keep hearing people say that. And no, that's not what Hippler was asking them to do. It was just they were going to say, hey, we received a tip that we should look into Brian Kohberger. So we looked into him further, did the STR match with the garbage, et cetera, et cetera. But IGG is going to be used a lot more now. It was used in the Rachel Marin case to help find her killer. It's not just solving cold cases. And, I'm glad the technology is out there, because look at how many cold cases have been solved recently because of IGG. Now there's a lot of controversy with the FBI going the backdoor route instead of going through the law enforcement portal. And it's not illegal. It was already discussed. Hippler already discussed that as well. Terms of service of a website are not a law. So if you violate the terms of service of a website, you're not breaking any laws. So the FBI did nothing illegal. Their best practices are there as the method they should try first. And as long as they're not breaking the law, which they weren't, they can try other methods. And I'm glad they tried other methods, because it led them to Kohberger. And then the law enforcement did the rest of the legwork, and sure enough, it DNA matched. And that's the other thing. For anybody saying that the lab didn't find anything the first time, that is absolutely not true. The Idaho State Police Lab found DNA on the sheath the very first time. but Kohberger was not in CODIS, so it didn't return a match. Okay, and then when the sample grew in size, that's because they amplify it when they do certain DNA tests, including SNP samples. That doesn't mean it was manipulated incorrectly or that anything nefarious took place. You have to do DNA amplification many times with testing. So I can do some follow-up videos on that if you like. That's a whole other, avenue to go down. But I just thought it was important that people understand why IGG is not directly admissible at court, but it's handled like a tip. And it is an investigative tool, and it is a very valuable investigative tool in this day and age.